On the morning of November the 6th, 1895, thousands of New Yorkers crowded the sidewalks along Fifth Avenue. Police held the lines outside St. Thomas Church, while carriages delivered the most powerful families in America to their pews. The newspapers had already crowned it the wedding of the century. Inside, 60 musicians and a full choir waited on the groom, Charles Spencer-Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, master of Blenheim Palace and holder of one of the oldest titles in England. The bride was late. A few blocks away, in her father's mansion, 18-year-old Consuelo Vanderbilt sat in her wedding gown, weeping. A footman stood guard at her door. Her face had to be bathed and composed before anyone dared lower the veil. She later wrote that she spent the morning of her wedding day alone, in tears. She was not crying from nerves, she was crying because she had just been sold. The price had been settled by lawyers. $2.5 million in railroad stock, worth roughly $80 million today, would pass from the Vanderbilt family to the Duke, along with a guaranteed income of $100,000 a year. In return, an American girl would become a duchess, and her mother would conquer the one fortress that American money had never been able to buy its way into, the European aristocracy. This was the machinery of the Gilded Age. American fortunes were young, enormous, and hungry for legitimacy. British titles were ancient, glamorous, and broke. Between the two stood a generation of daughters who were traded like assets. The press called them the dollar princesses, and no trade of that era was more famous than the one sealed inside St. Thomas Church that November morning. This is the story of how it was made, what it cost, and how one woman spent 30 years taking herself back. The story begins with her mother, because everything in Consuelo's early life did. Alva Vanderbilt was born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama, and watched her family's fortune wither after the Civil War. The lesson she carried out of that collapse was brutal and simple. In her world, a woman had one real form of power, and it was marriage. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore, and treated his railroad fortune as a siege engine. When old New York refused to receive the Vanderbilts, Alva built a marble chateau on Fifth Avenue and threw a costume ball so extravagant that Mrs. Astor, the gatekeeper of American society, was finally forced to call on her. Alva did not join high society. She breached its walls. Her daughter became the next campaign. At Marble House in Newport, Consuelo was raised less like a child than like a crown asset. Governesses drilled her in French and German. During lessons, she was strapped to a steel rod that ran the length of her spine, fastened at her waist and shoulders so that her posture would be beyond criticism. Alva chose her clothes, her books, her friends, and as far as possible, her thoughts. Consuelo later said she was not even consulted on the gown she would cry in at her own wedding. In the spring of 1895, the plan met its one obstacle. Consuelo fell in love. Winthrop Rutherford was American, well-born and rich, and during a bicycle ride that March, the two became secretly engaged. To Alva, this was worse than scandal. It was waste. An American husband would add nothing the family did not already own. Her response was total war. She took her daughter to Europe and intercepted every letter Rutherford sent. Back at Marble House, Consuelo was confined to the estate, watched by servants and cut off from visitors. In their final confrontation, Consuelo declared that she would marry the man she loved. Alva answered that she would shoot him first. Then she deployed her last weapon. She collapsed. Doctors were summoned, and a family friend carried a message to Consuelo's room. Her mother was dying of a heart condition brought on by her daughter's defiance. Consuelo gave in. She agreed to renounce Rutherford, and her mother's recovery was immediate and complete. That September, the Duke of Marlborough came to Marble House, and in its Gothic room he proposed. Consuelo had known him for barely a season, and the two had almost never been alone together. The engagement was announced within days, and the lawyers went to work. The Vanderbilt marriage was one transaction in an organised market. Between the 1870s and the First World War, more than 100 American heiresses married into the British peerage. The trade was public enough that a New York publication called Titled Americans printed a directory of eligible noblemen, listing their titles, their estates, and their financial condition, the way a catalogue lists merchandise. The supply side of that market was desperation. British aristocratic wealth stood on land, and land was failing. From the 1870s onward, cheap grain from the American Midwest poured into Europe, and rents across the English countryside collapsed. The great estates began to devour their owners. There is a hard irony in it. The same railroads that built fortunes like the Vanderbilts were helping to bankrupt the aristocracy those fortunes longed to join. Blenheim Palace was among the hungriest estates in England, granted by Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough as a reward for the battle that gave the palace its name. It held 187 rooms and consumed money on a matching scale. The family had been stripping it for a generation before Consuelo ever saw it. The Duke's grandfather sold the celebrated Marlborough gems and a library 2 centuries in the making. His father sold the great paintings, including a Raphael that hangs today in London's National Gallery. What the 9th Duke inherited at the age of 20 was a magnificent shell and a single overriding duty: save Blenheim, whatever the cost. By the accounts of those who knew him, the Duke understood his position with cold clarity. He was small, precise, and utterly bound to the palace, and he regarded its survival as the purpose of his life. An American fortune was the one instrument that could rescue it, and Consuelo Vanderbilt came attached to the largest fortune then on offer. The settlement was blunt. 50,000 shares of railroad stock, valued at $2.5 million, were transferred to the Duke, with the dividend guaranteed at 4% by the Vanderbilts, roughly $100,000 a year, payable whether the marriage thrived or died. Further allowances were settled on the couple, and over the following decades, the total cost to the family would reach an estimated $10 million. One detail stripped away whatever romance remained. The financial settlement was signed in the vestry of St. Thomas Church on the wedding day itself, moments after the ceremony. Before the bride and groom had left the building, the lawyers had their signatures. The same roof, within the same hour, witnessed the exchange of rings and the exchange of assets. At the altar, guests noticed that the bride's eyes were red and swollen behind her veil. The couple departed for their honeymoon as strangers, and somewhere in those first weeks, the Duke offered his new wife one piece of perfect honesty that would define the next 25 years. The Duke told Consuelo the truth. He too had given up the person he loved. There was a woman in England he had wished to marry, and he had renounced her, because Blenheim required a fortune and duty came before feeling. An 18-year-old girl and a 23-year-old Duke had been sold to each other by the same pitiless logic. Neither had chosen it. Both were expected to perform it. Blenheim in winter made the terms of that performance plain. The palace was magnificent, at a distance, and punishing to live in. The rooms were vast, stone cold and unheated, the plumbing was primitive, and dinner was served with full ceremony even when the Duke and Duchess dined alone. Consuelo described evenings at that table where her husband sat in silence at the far end, lost in his own discontent, while footmen stood against the walls and pretended not to exist. Some nights, she recalled, barely a word passed between them from the first course to the last. Her duties, at least, were explicit. English society expected a duchess to produce an heir and a spare, a phrase Consuelo herself is often credited with coining, and she delivered. A son, John, arrived in 1897 and secured the Marlborough line. A second son, Ivor, followed in 1898. As the contract understood her purpose, it was fulfilled before she turned 22. Her money, meanwhile, was fulfilling its own. Roofs were repaired, staterooms restored, gardens rebuilt. Blenheim, which had been dying by inches for half a century, was saved by Vanderbilt railroad money. The palace received everything it had been promised. Consuelo received something no contract had specified. People loved her. The tenants and villagers around Blenheim found their American Duchess warm in a way the world she had married into was not, and she took them seriously, visiting the sick and funding local causes. Inside the family, she found one true ally, her husband's first cousin, a young officer and ambitious politician named Winston Churchill, who had been born at Blenheim 21 years before the wedding. The friendship between them lasted the rest of their lives. None of it amounted to a marriage. By 1906, after 11 years, the Duke and Duchess formally separated, and Consuelo moved to London. The palace kept the money. She left with her sons, her title, and an unfinished piece of business that would take another 20 years to complete. The second half of Consuelo's life reads like a deliberate answer to the first. In London, separated but still a duchess, she turned her name and her money into instruments of her own choosing. She funded homes for women and children, campaigned for child welfare, and championed working women at a time when a duchess was expected to open flower shows and vanish. In 1917, she stood for election to the London County Council, and she won. The girl once forbidden to choose her own husband was now a public official, chosen by voters. In 1921 came the formal ending. The divorce was finalised that spring, and a few months later, Consuelo married again, this time entirely on her own terms. Jacques Balsan was a French pioneer of early aviation who had flown balloons and airplanes when both pursuits were considered close to suicidal, and by every account their marriage was a happy one. They settled in France, where Consuelo poured her energy into hospitals and children's charities. Then, in 1926, the past returned in the strangest form imaginable. The Duke, who had remarried, wanted his new union recognised by the Catholic Church, and that required the original marriage to be annulled. A church tribunal in Rome, the Sacred Roman Rota, took the case, and the case rested on a single claim, that in 1895 Consuelo had been forced. The star witness was Alva, past 70, long remarried, and by then famous across America as a leading fighter for women's right to vote. She gave sworn testimony that she had compelled her daughter into the marriage, overridden her protests, and left her no choice at all. The woman who had spent a lifetime refusing to apologise chose, at the end, to confess to everything. The tribunal granted the annulment. In the eyes of the church, the wedding of the century had never taken place. The ruling made front pages on both sides of the Atlantic, and much of the coverage was furious. American editorials attacked the church, the Duke, and above all Alva, demanding to know how a marriage that produced 2 sons and lasted a quarter of a century could be erased. Consuelo let the storm pass. She had what she wanted. The last trace of the transaction was gone. Mother and daughter ended, remarkably, at peace. Alva spent her final years in France near Consuelo, and when she died in 1933, her daughter was with her. Consuelo outlived nearly everyone in this story. She escaped France ahead of the German invasion in 1940, settled in America, and in 1953 published a memoir with a pointed title, The Glitter and the Gold. She died in December 1964 at the age of 87, and she left one final instruction. She chose to be buried in England, in the small churchyard at Blenheim, within sight of Blenheim Palace, beside her son, Ivor. A few weeks later, Winston Churchill was laid to rest in the same churchyard. The palace she was traded for still stands, and Vanderbilt money is part of the reason. The woman they traded rests a short walk away, in ground she chose for herself. The Dollar Princess closed her story with the one thing the contract had never priced, the right to choose her own ending.